Welcome back. And it's been a long time since I saw the first part of this video, the German Revolution, by Things I Care About. And he's been very busy in the meantime. He's made videos on the Korean War, on the Vietnam War, and on Israel versus Palestine, right? So the first time I actually watched the German Revolution, it was on October 6th of 2023, and then October 7th. Well, we all know what happened. So it's good to see a new history channel, though, and it's good to see him that he's making great content. It's very much in the oversimplified style. I don't think he's trying to hide that at all. I mean, it's even the same font. But nonetheless, it's good to see a new history channel, and I wanted to do part 2 to this because I made part 1 9 months ago. I never made a part 2. It's a topic that I'm also really quite familiar with, so hopefully I'll be able to provide some good commentary. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let's get into it.
So, where were we? Alright, after the Treaty of Versailles forced the Weimar Republic to reduce its military, Defense Minister Noske tried to dismiss 2 of the most powerful Freikorps divisions, but they refused, and instead marched into Berlin and took over. The Weimar government was forced to flee, and the leader of the coup, Wolfgang Kapp, declared himself Chancellor with support of the old elites of the German Empire.
Yes. So basically what happened before this point, just to sum it up very briefly, is that the German Revolution happened. And what it was is that you basically had the workers that had risen up in Berlin, right? And you had the KPD and you had the SPD. Again, I'm very much oversimplifying it here, but you basically had the moderate left wing, so to say, and then the far left wing. The Spartakists were a part of this, right? The Spartakists were led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. However, what their influence is sort of more become folklore, right? They were a very small group, and while they were intellectually influential, it was more like the unions of shopkeepers, right? They were very, very powerful because they were able to organize the masses, right? The Spartakists, yes, they had a lot of infighting, and as time went on, they would sort of be memorialized, especially in the East German government. And Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg are quite famous figures to this day. But it was more these left-leaning elements and the infighting between them that led to the SPD basically making backroom deals, for lack of a better word, between the right conservatives and even some of the Freikorps members here, who would eventually assassinate Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and would eventually sort of bring the government sort of back into any sort of state of order. Kapp would then come in and try his own putsch, and I'm not going to spoil it here for him. I think he's about to explain it, so we'll go from there.
And something's wrong with it.
Or he's going to watch Friends.
With the left phalange.
Whichever one.
Silly feet.
You know, I've actually never seen Friends, ever. I watched How I Met Your Mother, never seen a single full episode of Friends. Never been appealing to me. I don't know why.
I'm sure there's nothing wrong with the plane. All right, look, I have to go. I
the
love
Freikorps
you,
are taking over. You are the Weimar Republic's military. You have to do something. Oh, jeez. I'd love to be able to help. I really would. But I'm kind of in the middle of something here. Ross is rushing to the airport to stop Rachel from leaving to Paris forever. Can't you just, watch it later? The Freikorps are trying to take over the country. Listen, it's not that I don't care or that I never really liked the Weimar government to begin with, yeah, I don't really care, and I never even liked you guys anyways. The military across Germany either remained neutral or straight up supported the coup, just like the upper echelons of the bureaucracy who longed for their privileges under the empire. But what
it's tough to say that it was either two camps, either you don't care or you supported the Kapp putsch. There was obviously a lot of support among the troops for the Kapp putsch, right? There was the stab in the back theory that was quite popular on sort of, again, it's tough to use sort of left and right, but the right, conservative, ones that were more leading towards even bringing back the monarchy, right? Of that the Social Democrats and the Socialists had stabbed the troops in the back, right? And this would obviously come to be much more important during the 1920s and everything like this. But the military leadership certainly was either in an I don't care or I'm supporting the Kapp putsch here. The military leadership was very conservative, right? You have to remember democracy is sort of a new idea here for Germany. It had never been done before. And they were definitely in a way of saying, okay, well, maybe we can restore the monarchy. Maybe we can push some sort of new military junta government forward. And I'm oversimplifying it here, but the ideology was quite clear in that Weimar was a compromise between the left and the right. And neither side really liked it.
Kapp's government did not have was support from the workers.
And legitimacy.
Before leaving Berlin, the Weimar government had called for a general strike. The Democratic, Socialist and Communist parties immediately heeded the call, and they were not messing around.
And that's exactly how it happened too, right? I mean, Erbert, he got on top of the Reichstag and there was just a big, there was just a big hammer up there and the workers, they all came to strike. It was exactly like that.
12 million workers joined the strike.
Yep.
12 million. That is 1 out of
history.
every 5 people in the country.
Yep.
This would become the most powerful workers' strike in German history. The country was completely paralyzed. In Berlin, gas, water and power supplies halted entirely. Newspapers stopped printing. Bureaucracy came to a complete standstill. Any sort of long-distance communication was impossible, and Kapp and Lüttwitz were unable to govern. Trying to consolidate power, Freikorps and the military divisions engaged workers in bloody battles. The military prevailed over the workers in Thuringia and Saxony, while the workers and the Red Army won in the Ruhr. A former soldier by the name of Adolf Hitler, eager to help the coup, flew to Berlin to meet with the organizers, but by the time he arrived, the coup had already collapsed. The Weimar government returned, and the coup plotters escaped Germany with help from the police. But
did he want to help the... Why am I remembering? I might be completely wrong, but why do I remember that at this point he was working for the army and he was spying on some of the... Anyways.
After the putsch collapsed, workers in the Ruhr did not stop striking. Workers had been responsible for saving the government. Many had died in the fighting, and now they wanted something in return. They demanded better wages and improved worker conditions, as well as the retreat from all remaining Freikorps. Okay, so we agree. The government will pardon any illegal acts committed in resistance to the Kapp putsch, but you will cooperate with us in disarming the Red Army. That works for me. Thank you so much for your... Hey boss, check this out. These dummies are not even fighting back.
Yeah.
While workers negotiated with the government, a military commander acting on his own brutally suppressed the strikes, leading to even bigger strikes and the termination of negotiations. Now a combination of Reichswehr and Freikorps, including units that had participated in Kapp's coup, moved against the Red Army. By the end of the fighting, the Red Army was defeated. Reichswehr and Freikorps lost a combined total of around 500 lives, while an estimated 1,000 workers were killed.
And it's important to note here that the Reichswehr in this term is actually the army, right? Like the proper organized military. Whereas the Freikorps is a paramilitary organization. They're not a part of the government or any sorts of things like this. So the sort of, I don't know what to quite call it here, but I suppose irony is the fact that you have paramilitary troops that are acting, I don't know if illegally is the right term, but certainly acting of their own accord. And then you had Reichswehr troops that were actually an arm of the government, right? So you had not only right-wing paramilitary forces, but also legitimate, so to say, military forces that are suppressing these strikes as well, right? It's a deal with the devil, if you will.
The Ruhr Uprising was a clear demonstration of the power and unity of Germany's working class. It also showed clearly how the German government was consistently willing to exert violence to preserve the power and privilege of the ruling class.
That's one interpretation of it, yeah. Yeah, that is, fair enough.
Germany became even more polarized. After the end of the fighting, Germany finally went through a period of relative peace, and by that I mean that there were just no coup attempts, at least for now. But political assassinations were incredibly frequent, and they were carried out almost exclusively by right-wing extremists to left-wing politicians.
Yep.
Matthias Erzberger, who played a central role in negotiating and signing the Treaty of Versailles, was assassinated. Walter Rathenau, a Jewish foreign minister who was trying to improve relations with the Soviet Union, was also assassinated by an anti-socialist anti-Semite. Between 1918 and 1922, there were at least 376 assassinations. 354 of them were linked to far-right extremists. Of those cases, only 18 were ever prosecuted, and only one of those prosecuted was one of the right-wing assassins. If you thought things in Germany were dire at this point, well, think again. Because during World War I, Germany paid for the war efforts by consciously inflating the war economy.
Before we get to that, I want to make the point on political assassinations and that, Yeah, I mean, it was really a truly awful time as well. And as he's going to talk now with the inflation it made, even the economic prosperity is even worse. But nonetheless, the ideological divide here. My God, can I speak English? Between the left and the right, and the right's willingness to use violence so frequently, and there was obviously the left that was also also willing to use violence, especially those that were more, what would you say, influenced or more, willing to be sort of Moscow's chess pieces, if you will. It was a lot of political violence, and it was destabilizing, right? Because you would have the presses that would obviously pick up on this. They would inflate it, and depending on which either way the newspaper leaned to, it was just this seemingly non-stop sense of violence in this country that before World War One, I'd never truly experienced it in this manner before.
Which was actually a common thing. Britain, France and the US did this too, and after winning they went through a readjustment period, which meant a recession, unemployment, all of which is common in the transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy. But the Weimar authorities didn't believe they could afford this transition, so they continued with the wartime policies. This meant that in the short term, they had more money to spend for progressive social and welfare policies. But eventually, there would be a reckoning. In January 1923, Germany was unable to pay their war debt, and France declared Germany in default. French and Belgian troops marched into the Rhineland and took control of most of its mining and manufacturing companies for about 2 years. We can't just let them take all our resources.
And again, this is also, playing into the sort of our countries being taken over, right? We're being quite literally occupied by foreign forces, even though we've lost the war, and it's just building, right? Just building all this tension. Was France justified in doing this? That's a different question. Did it ultimately lead to more harm than good? Probably. But nonetheless, I think France went occupied for like 15 years or something, right? That was the original plan. I could be wrong on that, but it was a long time.
We're already broke. Don't worry, I have an incredible idea.
Print
they
more.
can't take our resources if we don't produce any. But how will we eat? And how will I pay for my super yachts? I have rights, you know? Don't worry, we will pay for all your expenses so that you don't feel a thing. But how would we pay for that? No, don't do it. Don't print more money. In 1919, $1 was worth 14 marks. By 1921, it was 1 to 64. By January 1922, it was 1 to 191. 1 year later, it was 1 to 17,972. In August of the same year, $1 was worth 109,996 marks. And in November 1923, just a few months later, $1 was worth 1,420 billion marks.
You heard that right. So you can imagine, right, if you're pre-war, or even post-war, right, you decide to retire, you get back from the front, you take your life savings, you want to, do whatever you want with it, and then your money's worthless, right, in just a few years. And it is obviously a little bit more complicated than this, but you had people's life savings that were entirely wiped out, just gone, right? Imagine 40 years of working, 50 years of working, and your life savings is done because of this hyperinflation. And so, you had the famous stories. I don't know how true they are, but at least the anecdote is that you would have people that would be paid twice during the day, laborers. They would be paid at lunch so that they could go buy bread, because when they would be let off work, the bread would cost 4 times as much. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I've heard that a couple times.
Was worth 1,420 billion marks. The cost of a loaf of bread went from 3 marks in 1922 to 80 billion Reichsmark in November 1923. To be able to survive, workers were paid 3 times a day. They were
There you go, 3 times a day.
paid immediately upon arrival and brought someone along with them. That person would receive the money and go buy lunch. This had to be done quickly, because by lunchtime, the money they had received that same morning would have become worthless. At lunch, they did the same for dinner, but they were safe in the afternoon once the markets were closed. As a consequence of inflation, millions lost their life savings, crime surged, and many opted to end their lives.
Yep. Look at that. Look at that amount of cash, right? Look at that. That is more than your average, before the war, that is more than your average person's life savings. of that just sitting on that one table there, and that's going to buy you maybe dinner. Insane.
But people being forced to immediately spend any money they earned meant that young people learned to buy and trade in foreign stocks, finding some sort of financial stability.
Yeah.
This became so widespread that almost every newspaper, no matter how small, now included the latest news on the stock market. But with hyperinflation, civil discontent surged once again. Charismatic leaders sprung up across Germany, each of them promising to be the solution to the nation's problems. One claimed the solution to be singing and praying. Another one claimed the solution to be the eradication of the German Jewish population. That man's name, as you may have guessed, was Adolf Hitler. Let's rewind a little bit. Hitler had been working as a sort of spy for the army, charged with investigating newly formed parties. In 1919, he was tasked with infiltrating a party called the German Workers' Party, which his superiors believed could be socialist. However, to Hitler's surprise, the party was not only not socialist, but actually a fiercely nationalist and anti-socialist organization.
I like this sign here. All welcome to the German Workers' Party except Jews, Romani, gays, Poles, socialists, communists, Democrats, don't know what it says, cut off there, probably people of color or something, disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviets, Freemasons, Afro-Germans, Spaniards, Sinti, and Larli. That was horrible. Serbs, Ukrainians, and Lithuanians, Latvians, Sinti, Roma, Croatian partisans, and more. Yeah. So there was a slew of hyper right. Again, I don't like these terms, but whatever, right? Very far right-wing parties, very authoritarian parties. However, and this is what's important, it wasn't always they weren't always very pro-capitalist. They weren't the sort of big business, state-controlled business that we would eventually see the Nazi Party to become. A lot of them were trying to seek a third way, right? Seeking a third way between capitalism and socialists. This doesn't mean that they were good-hearted individuals. They were also ruthless anti-Semites, and a lot of them blamed the Jews for and other foreign influence, socialist, communist, whatever, for the current economic situation. However, there were some true ideologues that were very anti-capitalist that were working in some of these parties. The German Workers' Party specifically, which eventually became the NASDAQ, or the Nazi Party, obviously, this sort of anti-capitalist bent, so to say, would change throughout the 20s as the party got bigger, as Hitler's hold on the party cemented, and a lot of the ideologues, the sort of old fighters, right, but not the old fighters, the brown shirts, but the sort of old members of the party would be kicked out, right? And I think Drexten is probably or Drexel, I can't remember off the top of my head, Drexler maybe, is one of the most famous ones, that he was the anti-capitalist sort of wing leader, so to say, of the Nazi Party, who would eventually be let go and tossed aside.
Socialist, but actually a fiercely nationalist and anti-social.
And yes, very important, incredibly nationalist. That was the one thing that tied them all together. I think rather than saying right wing, left wing, whatever, very, very nationalist
organization. Hitler soon joined and rose to the top thanks to his passionate and powerful rhetoric. But the party was still small. Realizing that a large portion of the German population was now identifying either with socialist or hyper-nationalist ideals, they came up with a clever plan. They renamed their party the National Socialist German Workers' Party, a name that was deliberately contradicting, looking to lure in as many people as possible.
Yep. Yeah, exactly, right? So it was trying to sort of get the workers to sort of have depending on who Hitler was in front of, right, during the elections during the late 20s and early 30s, he would slightly change his message depending on who he was looking at, right? So if he was talking to the workers, it would be more of an anti-capitalist bent, right, blaming big business and stuff. If he was in front of big business parties, then it was obviously changing things up so that they wouldn't be changing workers' policies, for example, right? And so Hitler, even at this point, was not the leader of the party, but he was rather the Trommler, right, the drummer, so the sort of one who would build up support in this. While he would eventually become the leader, that's who they were seeking at this time, right? I'm going to guess this is 1922, 1923 or so, maybe earlier. But they're seeking their leader at this current point, and Hitler really is just a mouthpiece. And yes, he does have a gift of rhetoric. No one can deny that, right? Hitler's one of the most horrendous people to have ever inherited this earth. The man had a gift of rhetoric, period.
In German, a socialist is called Sozialist. So conservatives and right-wingers tended to use the abbreviated form Sozi as a pejorative for the Sozialisten. As the NSDAP members began to use this pejorative, socialists retaliated by using a similarly sounding pejorative, Nazi. However, as time went on, the term gained popularity and eventually became the mainstream nickname for party members and its adherents. Nazis were not shy about their goal, to end German democracy, which they viewed as the root of their misery, and punish those who had brought it upon them, Jews and real socialists. In November 1923, inspired by what Mussolini had done in Italy a year prior, Hitler led a group of Nazis and brown shirts.
Even though Mussolini was just mostly invited in, right? The March on Rome is not really much of a March on Rome, and its propaganda is still being felt. Yeah, 101 years later now. I won't get into details, but basically, it was not really a March on Rome. It was more of a lukewarm invitation.
The party's paramilitary group to the Bavarian Defense Ministry. Famous World War I General Erich Ludendorff joined them, dressed in his full military uniform. Stop right there, or we will shoot. We will.
And this is in Munich as well, right? In case that wasn't said.
Not stop. You will have to shoot us. Well, okay then. While Hitler and his conspirators ran away, Ludendorff continued his march. No soldier dared to fire at the renowned general, and he reached the soldiers unharmed. He was greeted cordially, and the soldiers even apologized as they arrested him. Hitler...
Yeah, and so Ludendorff at this point is one of the most famous people in Germany, right? With him and Hindenburg, by the end of the First World War, they were practically running the country. The Kaiser wasn't. But I want to go back just a few seconds here. So this poor chap here on the left, who's going to meet his demise in 1 second, it was only maybe a foot away, right? Maybe about 30 centimeters away from hitting Hitler. So they had their arms linked at this point, and they were forming sort of a human line. And the individual to Hitler's left was shot and killed. I don't remember the name, but he's one of the individuals that eventually got a memorial in Munich that still is kind of standing to this day. I've been there; it's just a concrete base, but can only imagine, right? A few centimeters to the right. Who knows?
No, he was greeted cordially, and the soldiers even apologized as they arrested him. Hitler was arrested and tried, but once again, the conservative judiciary was incredibly lenient. Many of Hitler's co-conspirators pleaded not guilty and were quickly released. Hitler, however, wished to use his trial to make a spectacle and refused to plead not guilty. If overthrowing a government made of November criminals is high treason, then I am guilty. If wanting to restore the majesty of the German Reich is treason, then I am guilty. If trying to restore the honor of the German army is high treason, then I am guilty. You get the point. He was only sentenced to 5 years with the possibility of early pardon, and he was released after only 8 months.
That was one of the... Oh, that's one of the most... I remember reading this in Kershaw's book. This was one of the most hair-pulling mistakes that you can only imagine what would have happened. Because during these 8 months, the Nazi Party fell apart, right? Without... Again, Hitler's the leader at this point, right? He's no longer the drummer, and he's no longer the Trommler, the mouthpiece, right? Well, he's still a mouthpiece, but these 8 months, the party almost completely disintegrated. Those in the north, right, in Schleswig-Holstein and some of the other northern provinces, had actually broken off and formed their own party during this time because there was no leadership. It was chaos, right? After the 8 months of a 5-year sentence that he got, he was swiftly released, quickly organized, and the Nazi Party was back on the scene. If he had have just stayed in there even for an extra 4 months, and the party had have completely fallen apart, oh, my light died. The party had have completely fallen apart and gone its own way and formed off into splinter groups and whatever, maybe there's a chance that it would have never even been able to be put back together by Hitler. Who knows? But yeah, serving 8 months out of 5 years, and the 8 months too, he gets all sorts of famous visitors and all this junk, and he writes Mein Kampf and blah, 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 and he uses the courtroom, which is picked up by the press every day, by the way, right, making Hitler one of the most famous people in Germany, because the press too is also sending these new, he's not just some Bavarian rabble-rouser. Now people in, Hamburg, people in Düsseldorf and Essen and all these things now know about this guy who's saying, all the right things. If I'm guilty for wanting my motherland to be a great place, whatever. But yeah, those 4 months that if he had have stayed for an extra 4 months, who knows? Maybe the Nazi Party disintegrates, and if he had served his full 5 years, it definitely would have disintegrated. The political movements at that point would have been completely shifted, and maybe Hitler would have died completely unknown, which would have been the best thing.
Prison did little more than give him time to write his famous book and made his name known across Germany. The NSDAP was banned, but continued to operate under a different name.
Yes.
In late 1923, the German government was finally able to control inflation. They cut off credit, quadrupled interest rates, laid off 750,000 white-collar employees, as well as 150,000 civil servants who thought had lifelong tenures. So even though they solved one of Germany's biggest problems, their reputation only worsened. Still, the period between 1924 and 1928 was one of relative stability. The economy grew, and the country faced relatively little civil unrest.
Yeah, it's referred to as the golden years of the Weimar Republic.
In the meantime, Hitler managed to get the ban on his party lifted, and in 1928, the NSDAP entered their first elections since 1924. Although they only got 2% of the votes, they did manage to get 12 seats in parliament. Soon after, Goebbels became head of propaganda. He changed the plan: identify a particular subject and then throw all the leaflets and pamphlets into it. They wanted to focus on small towns where other parties were absent and leave a mark. They just needed something to happen to anger the population, and then they would be ready to prey on their fears. German economic stability relied heavily on US investments and loans. If anything happened and these American short-term loans were withdrawn, it would be in deep trouble. Buy, buy, buy! Oh god, I love capitalism. We can speculate endlessly without any repercussions. I know, right? The market would grow forever. Buy, buy! But what if it doesn't? Sell, sell, sell! The US economy crashed in 1929, and it took the fragile German economy down with it. To make matters worse, the last elections left no clear majorities in the Reichstag, and Heinrich Brüning, a Catholic center politician, became chancellor. He basically said to the German public, "The only way out of this depression is for us to tighten our belts. We need to balance the budget, cut government expenditures, and that may mean getting rid of unemployment insurance. It may mean cutting way back into the expensive Weimar social welfare programs, and it means we're going to see a way of layoffs and raise taxes." No. Come on. No. Please? No. Pretty please? No. Pretty please with a cherry on top? No. Brüning insisted that this was the right thing to do, but no one wanted to take responsibility for such unpopular measures, and he had no support from the Reichstag. Thus, Brüning made use of Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. With his emergency powers, Brüning dissolved parliament and called for new elections.
Yeah, and so this political deadlock, right? When you have people that are unwilling, one, to reach against, to sort of, what would you say, make deals across the aisle, right? So when you don't have the center parties making deals with the left because they think that the left are full of a bunch of socialists, even though the SDP at this point were, probably moderately left at best. And then you have the conservatives being absolutely terrified of the socialists and the FDP. Oh my God. Yes, the FDP, the what would you say, the center right party in Germany, anyway, in modern Germany. Anyways, of them being terrified against the socialists, and then they're willing to make deals with the Nazi party. We'll get to that though.
This was a catastrophic mistake.
Yes.
All mainstream parties had been responsible for some part of Germany's problems, either signing the armistice, failing to solve inflation, or the harsh stabilization that came after. But the NSDAP was not. They had...
And the KPD, right? It's important to note too, you had the far left and the far right, both wanting to clearly end democracy. There was no question about this, right? The NASDAP wanted to end democracy, and the KPD wanted to end democracy. They just wanted to inflict it in different ways. Nonetheless, the goal here was to eliminate liberal democracy. And the Altparteien, right, the old parties, the SPD, the Catholic Center Party, and the DVP, I think it was, they're completely to blame here, right? They're the mainstream parties. And so people then are going to go to the fringes when the mainstream parties are not able to answer and have solutions to the problems of the day. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Yeah.
Never been in power, and thus they were not to blame for any of the political problems. And they were ready to take full advantage of it. They relentlessly hammered at the faults of other parties in a campaign run by Goebbels, who created a network of informants who sat in public places and listened to people's worries. Goebbels then used that information to create propaganda specifically designed for each group. The propaganda would often be contradictory. They appealed to Catholics and Protestants, to workers and business people, to farmers and white-collar workers. No other party did anything like this. To Goebbels.
And it's important to remember too that during this time in 1928 is that mass mobilization of politics. This is brand new, right? 50 years ago, none of these people that they're targeting could even vote, right? It was landholding. I'm going to use the wrong term, but landholding individuals, the upper class, and the incredibly wealthy, right? If anyone could vote at all, right? And so mass mobilization politics is what we take as sort of, yeah, okay, well, of course, everyone can vote and you have to appeal to as many groups as possible and all sorts of things. This is really cutting edge. This is really pioneering. I mean, before this, women couldn't even vote, right? Before the war, women could not vote. It was the emancipation and the suffrage for women, and it happened after the war in Germany. And so the fact that you can have this idea where you're sort of what would you say, making segments of the general population and trying to appeal to them for their specific issues, the old parties didn't really quite work like this, right? This mass mobilization of politics is a very important point that I think people forget when it comes to why did the Nazis get so popular and why were they so effective? Because this was a whole new game, and they were discovering and playing it incredibly well. And the KPD, although there was a little bit more issues, they were doing it as well.
And the NSDAP, the message was not important. The only thing that mattered to them was to win the election and to end the democratic government, which they openly stated. After the elections, the NSDAP emerged with 18% of the votes. It made them the second largest party behind only the Social Democrats.
Yeah, and you can see that the third largest party here is the Communists, who will never work with the SPD. You combine their totals together here, you might have had a majority.
With their success, coalition.
But again, this isn't to say that the SPD, could have made a coalition with the KPD, but rather the SPD and the conservatives, right? The sort of democratic conservatives, right? So to say, ones that don't want to overthrow the government, don't want to overthrow democracy. That was the coalition that really should have been made. But the right was terrified of any sort of deal with the left because they thought, well, then we're all going to become like all going to become like the Soviet Union.
Forming in the government was impossible, and Brüning, refusing to change his policies, continued to govern exclusively using Article 48. We need to cut fiscal spending. No. Article 48. We need to lay off a few 100,000 people. No. Article 48. Excuse me, sir, do you have any idea how fast you were going? Article 48. Hey, son, it's already midnight. You can't play games all night. You have to go to sleep. Article 48. Brüning introduced unpopular legislation by using Article 48 a total of 100 times between 1930 and 1932. This was the beginning of the end of German democracy.
Yep.
And the Nazis didn't just go away after elections. More campaigning meant more members. More members meant more money. More money meant more propaganda campaigns. Propaganda became a self-financing operation. Confident in his support, Hitler decided to challenge the 85-year-old Hindenburg for the presidency in the 1932 elections.
And he lost.
The Nazi launched a massive media blitz unparalleled in German history. Over 30,000 rallies, meetings and demonstrations. Millions of leaflets were distributed. Speakers toured the country where the propaganda machine worked at full speed. Every week, they put out a new set of talks and leaflets and had members assess how well they were received. They would then adapt future campaigns based on what was most effective at persuading certain demographics.
And again, this has never been done before, right? It maybe in the UK, right? I'm not entirely sure, but in Germany, never been done.
They even had NSDAP public servants send individually written letters to certain people. Nothing like this had ever been done before. The brown shirts were critical in this period, organizing marches and handing out leaflets, and of course, intimidating
Violence.
political opponents.
Yes. And that's the thing too. The violence that they were willing to commit and how easily it was also one of the things, is that you have that factor of intimidation.
Hitler flew to almost every major city in Germany,
And the first German politician to fly in an airplane too.
often speaking in several cities in one day. The preparation, build-up and execution very often resembled modern rock concerts. But despite all of this, Hitler lost the election to Hindenburg. Still, he demanded to be appointed Chancellor. In tradition, he should have been, but Hindenburg despised him, so he refused.
Not only Hindenburg, but the entire conservative establishment too absolutely despised him, saw as a bohemian corporal, right?
At this point, the Nazis were finally taken seriously by other parties and big businesses, who saw them as a way to destroy socialist and communist movements. After a disagreement with Brüning, Hindenburg called for new elections, and Brüning was replaced by Franz von Papen. Papen wished to appeal to businesses and the old aristocracy. He lowered taxes for the wealthy and wages for workers, while also defunding welfare programs. All of this, of course, exclusively using Article 48. He called for new elections, believing he could gain over support from Nazis. This was another massive miscalculation. Nazis received 38% of the vote. Now, the majority of the parliament was opposed to its own existence, and sessions in the Reichstag no longer took place. As political action became once again impossible, elections were held again in November to break the stalemate. But this time, Nazi popularity dropped. They had claimed to be the solution, yet being the largest party, failed to implement any actual policies.
And I'm so glad he mentioned that. Exactly, right? It's very easy to sit in opposition and to say everything's wrong, everything's wrong, everything's wrong, we're going to make, but then when you're actually the largest party and nothing is changing because you don't have any real policies, you're just a, propaganda espousing machine, then people are going to start losing support for you. This is the critical moment when I was talking about before, when the right, again, the conservative right, the democratic right, should have been forming alliances with the left, but they didn't. And Franz von Papen did one of the stupidest things, I don't know, maybe of the 20th century? I don't know.
Hindenburg appointed as Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, who, just like
who von Papen absolutely despised.
Papen thought he could win over followers away from Hitler, but both of them failed, and by January 1933, it had become clear that the government was once again failing. Unable to govern, Hindenburg reached an agreement with Hitler. The Nazi Party agreed to form a coalition with the Conservatives, thus gaining a majority in the Reichstag, and he was appointed Chancellor. Now that he had finally become Chancellor, Hitler was ready to undo the democratic government, and he would begin purging those who had opposed him.
And not only that too, so they thought, it's a little unfortunate he didn't mention this here, but so the Conservatives did this because they thought that they could control him, right? They thought that, okay, if we're going to give him the position of power, people are going to see how much of a joke that he is, and then we're going to be able to come back on stage and magically make everything and get the super majority that the Conservatives want, and I don't know, then we can make some whatever, right? Whatever their ambitions were. They actually thought that they could control this guy, who has a massive grassroots movement, is the largest party in parliament, clearly wants to overthrow the government, and his ambition, although him not well, his ambitions on power, shall we say, are clearly limitless. And you gave this guy the chancellery, rather than working across the aisle, rather than figuring something out, rather than keeping the far right, whatever, the Nazis out of power. You decide to give him the chancellorship. What? Alter.
Ready to undo the democratic government, and he would begin purging those who had opposed him, communists and socialists.
Yep.
During
the first concentration camps opened not a few months after Hitler was chancellor.
Night of February 27th, the German parliament was set on fire. Take a moment to picture the impact this would have. Imagine how people would react if one night the US Congress was burned down.
Yep.
The NSDAP framed communists for the fire, and Hitler convinced Hindenburg that they were trying to overthrow them. Hindenburg agreed to issue the Reichstag Fire Decree, which nullified key civil liberties, including the right to speak, assemble, protest, and due process. In practice, it allowed Nazis to imprison anyone they considered to be a threat and to suppress publications unfriendly to their cause. Hitler still claimed that he did not have enough power to stop the alleged communist threat.
And so the Reichstag fire as well, it was committed, I believe it was by a Dutch socialist, if I remember correctly, a very young, not the brightest tool in the shed, shall we say. And for a long time, historians had thought, well, it was the Nazis who did it, right? And that this was a false flag operation. But the general consensus nowadays is that it was this young Dutch socialist. He was not framed or anything. He thought that, I don't even know what he thought was going to be how this was going to be the solution, but it was him. And you can only imagine this was a silver platter encrusted with diamonds, and serving gold on it for the Nazis and for Hitler. He couldn't have planned something this perfect to enact these decrees and to eventually become the totalitarian leader that he became.
The only way to stop the very real and totally not made up communist plot to destroy all of us is to pass an act that enables me to bypass you guys and that dumb.
And again, there is a bit of a communist plot here to completely overthrow democracy and get rid of it. But the fact that it was going to, what would you say? I don't know, commit genocide on Germans or something. It was übertrieben, right? It was over-exaggerated, that's the word.
I'm Hindenburg. So who's in favor? I knew I could count on you, my conservatives and nationalists. But what about the rest? We need more votes. No one else?
So kick him out.
How about we take that vote again? We are still just one vote short. Hey Jakob, how is that pretty wife of yours doing, huh? I saw her yesterday, She was picking up your 2 little kids. Oh, how cute they are. It would be such a shame if something were to happen to them. In March, the government...
And so the SPD, and I think it was Otto Wels, I think was his name. I might be getting that wrong, but it was the leader of the SPD at this point. Despite all the harassment, the armed individuals that were in parliament, the SPD and their constituents, regardless of what you think of them, still voted against it while under duress. Pretty impressive.
Began sending communists, socialists, and worker union leaders to the first concentration camp in Dachau. By July, all other parties had either been outlawed or intimidated into dissolving, and Germany officially became a one-party state. Hitler's dictatorship was almost consolidated. There remained but one problem. The German army worried that it might be absorbed by the SA, led by Ernst Röhm. Starting June 30, 1934, Hitler had many of his political opponents, and even some of his own followers, executed. During the Night of the Long Knives, the final remnants of resistance to the NSDAP dictatorship were eliminated, including the few real socialists within the party.
Yeah.
And finally, on August 2, 1934, President Hindenburg died of old age. Hitler combined the offices of President and Chancellor into one and took the title of Führer. During his dictatorship, Hitler
which means leader, by the way,
not only brutally persecuted minorities, but also annihilated worker unions by replacing them with the German Worker Front. Socialist movements were eradicated as the German Führer consolidated capitalist hold over the German economy.
Yeah.
And so, a revolution that started with dreams and aspirations of a fair and democratic Germany ended in one of the worst tyrannies of recent times, which would soon lead to the atrocities of the Holocaust and World War II.
And who's to blame for it all? Well, it's a lot of things, but one of the most important ones was that unable to reach democratic consensus and keeping extremists out of power at any means necessary, even if it means dissolving your own government to keep them out of power, right? Or working across the aisle against your own party. That's the most important thing. It happened in Belgium, right? The Rexists were never able to gain power because the left and the right, the moderate left, the moderate right, were able to work together to keep extremists out. And I think that's the lesson that we need to go on for today. Thank you very much for watching this one. It's a great channel. I'll do more videos from this one if you're interested. 44 minutes long. There you go. Double the video length. Yeah, I think I like this topic. Hope you learned something. Let me know what you thought in the comment section down below. Take care. See you in the next one.